So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'd like to introduce Cindy Wigglesworth, who's known for her work in the field of spiritual intelligence. And Cindy, you've developed a model that includes 21 skills of spiritual intelligence, which you describe as the ability to behave with wisdom and compassion while maintaining inner and outer peace. And the 21 skills are, among others, self-awareness, self-regulation, self-transcendence. And we'll be speaking more about these skills throughout this call. So yes, lovely to have you on.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I appreciate being invited, and good morning to both of you.
Good morning, Cindy. It's lovely to have you too. So for me, Cindy and I go back quite the ways back. I don't know when I would have exactly met you first, but it's probably at least 15 plus years. Cindy and I met way back in the day when in Boulder, Colorado, we used to have the Integral Institute seminars. And I have a very clear memory of Cindy attending many of those events that we had in Colorado. So I suppose the first question that I can ask is, Cindy, how were you introduced to Integral, and how did you end up in Colorado attending those seminars?
Yes, thanks for asking. So, I worked at Exxon for 20 years, and then I left in 2000 to start doing this research because I had such a call on my heart to do this work. And initially, I built this library. I mean, seriously, I built bookshelves along a whole wall and just packed it with books on world religions and things that I felt would be related to this field that I initially was calling spirituality and leadership, and then I refined it to spiritual intelligence. I got introduced first, let me think, to Suzanne Cook-Greuter's work through the Harvard article about the 7 transformations of a leader. And I went to the United Kingdom to get certified because that's what the certification class was in that tool. And Suzanne and David were co-teaching that class. And from that, I learned about, what did I learn? I learned from her about Ken Wilber or somebody handed me Grace and Grit at about the same time. I was working in the healthcare system, and MD Anderson Cancer Center was a client. And one of the ladies said, you have to read this book. So that was right about the same time I started learning about Ken Wilber. And then Ken introduced me to spiral dynamics because he mentioned spiral dynamics in that book. So all of this is swirling around in my head at the same time. And I'm trying to find out everything I can about integral theory. Somehow signed up for the right mailing list, got the email for the first ever conscious leadership workshop that Fred taught, and signed up within an hour of it hitting my inbox, I think. So I was in that very first Westminster session, and got to know so many people who have become dear friends since that time. I think Jeff Salzman was there, a bunch of folks that I've been able to stay in touch with. And then I think subsequent to that, you and I met through multiple Boulder events that I was coming up for.
Yes, absolutely. And that seminar with Fred Kaufman was actually not the first conference that we had. So you might have missed some of the first ones that we had. But certainly the one with Fred Kaufman was definitely one of the best we had.
Yeah.
Yes, and for anyone who doesn't know, Fred Kaufman is actually a vice president now of LinkedIn, I believe. And but prior to that, he was very much involved in the integral world and used to teach and also is the author of a very popular book called Conscious Business. So yeah, so when did you just one other question and then I'll hand over to Lee. The whole topic of spiritual intelligence, which is in some ways your baby, and I know you have also worked with Daniel Goleman, I believe. Yeah, is that correct?
I'm certified in his tool, and I have had direct contact with Richard Boyatzis, who he and Richard co-created that tool.
Okay.
So I don't have a personal relationship, but I got trained in his stuff back in the 1990s and love it.
Yeah, yeah. Going even perhaps earlier than that, I'm curious also to hear about at what point did this being called Cindy get curious about spirituality, or what did it mean for Cindy as perhaps a young girl, maybe even, or at what point did this spiritual meme get into you?
Yes. It's such an interesting thing to look back at your life and try and trace a thread. Oftentimes you can see it better looking backwards. If you spend some time like, oh, wow, that connected to that and that connected to that. It's kind of weird. I was raised Roman Catholic, and when I was quite young, 6 years old, we moved to India, and I actually got my first Holy Communion in Latin in Bombay. It was just a multicultural mix. And I was exposed at that time to the caste system and Hinduism, as well as all the other religions that are so present in India. I was also exposed to poverty for the first time. I had been, prior to that, being raised in suburban America, where, our house was a modest, nice home. I mean, a home that people would be very happy to have, but it wasn't a mansion. But I was never around people who were without. Everyone had food, everyone had a car, everyone had a house, and everyone had plenty of clothes. So I had never seen poverty and rampant public health issues like I was exposed to in Bombay, which of course is now called Mumbai. So I started really questioning, how is this God a loving God? And the issue around the caste system really bothered me. We had an untouchable who came to clean our toilets, and I was instructed not to make eye contact with him or I could damage his soul. And I'm like, don't make eye contact because you'll damage him. It's just like, wow. And so I think there was some kind of God doesn't make sense thing going on in my head very early. It caused me to really question, how is this loving God allowing so much suffering in the world? At that time, leprosy had not been cured. People were dying on the streets. I mean, the story I heard as a child was that they would go around in the morning, and if you didn't wake up, you got put in the back of the truck and hauled off because you died overnight. It's like, God, I don't know if that was true, but I imagine there was something equivalent to dealing with sanitation issues of people literally living on the streets and dying on the streets. So that set me off. And then as a teenager, we were living overseas again in Australia, and the Vietnam War was going on. There was a lot of anti-American sentiment in Australia at the time. So politics and global realities and multiculturalism was always present, but it was very sadly present during the Cold War. And I just kept praying for something. And I remember one day myself saying to myself, or the voice in my head said, what is it that you want? Because I was kind of in this depressed place. And I answered myself, I want wisdom. And I would say that moment when I was about 16 is probably when I committed to the path that got me here.
Wow, I certainly not anything I knew about that part of your history, Cindy. So that's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure. So, Lee, did you have some questions before I launch?
I was going to ask you to launch it, please, and indeed to introduce your model and highlight the aspects that you find, yeah.
The SQ21 model, yes, I'd be happy to do that. So let me share screen, and I'm going to go through these slides. It's a lot of slides, but don't fear. I understand how to skip around. So I will do that. All right. So the focus for me today, to make this relevant to integral listeners, is what's the connection between spiritual intelligence and functioning at what we might call second tier, in the spiral dynamic system, yellow and above. To get us there, I'm going to do a fast review of the 4 intelligences that I think are most crucial to be a leader, either professionally or personally, or really both. I'm going to focus on EQ and SQ because they're highly connected. I'll then explain my SQ model and connect it to integral theory, and we'll sort of wrap it up towards the end, both with how is it related to stages of development. We have some specific research on that, and some tips on how to develop your own SQ. My own background, I've talked a little bit about. Graduated from Duke, 20 years at ExxonMobil in human resources. I felt really strongly called while I was at Exxon to develop this tool because I knew what had difference my own personal growth was making in my leadership skills. And it was not anything covered in leadership development programming at that time. I felt it was a gap that was just enormous and glaring, but it was also a gap that was caused by the fact that people are terrified of talking about anything spiritual in a business context. So I went into private practice in 2000 to create this tool and to make a rigorous, validated approach to spiritual intelligence that I could then later take back, if I chose to, into as rigorous an environment as the oil industry, which I have done. So I moved around the world because my dad was in the oil industry. I ended up working in the oil industry, and we can talk about the oil industry later if you want to, but essentially I'm very grateful for that experience. I learned a lot. I worked with some super smart people who were living BS detectors. You know, they're always asking the hard questions, and how do you know that, and why is that true, and where is your data? So I was developed in a way to think critically that I think really helped in terms of my growth doing this work. When I left to start doing this work, Maslow was on my mind. Abraham Maslow's work had influenced me as a young woman. I really loved the pyramid, but his original pyramid ended with self-actualization. His final book, which I didn't find until right after I became self-employed and had time to read, was The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. And in that book, he talked about a stage of development beyond self-actualization, which he referred to as the self-transcenders. And that helped me begin creating a hierarchical model of development in my mind that goes from these physiological needs at the bottom to what I would now call spiritual needs at the top. So this was the beginning of my developmental thinking. And at this self-transcendent level, I would say this connects, if you read his description, to loss of ego and being of service to humanity, which will fit the description most people would have of spiritual intelligence. The next influence on me was Fowler's Stages of Faith, which I very much loved. It's a Christian perspective, but a universalizing perspective, because he goes from explaining what ends up mirroring childhood development very well: primal faith, what we might call purple innocent faith, mythic literal faith, synthetic conventional faith, which would be blue on the spiral, amber on Ken's system, then an orange individual reflective faith, and then conjunctive faith. The highest level is this universalizing faith, which I've color-coded here in yellow and teal or turquoise, to talk about. I think that's second tier. So in my mind, although I didn't know Ken's work yet, I was aligning also my work with the faith development stages. Then I found Suzanne Cook-Reuter's work, fell in love with it, later found Wilber and spiral dynamics, and I have come to sort of explain simply that stages of leadership and ego development can mirror nicely into the intelligences required to support them. And if we think about developing leaders, most of the leaders we interact with are at the expert or achiever levels, light blue or orange, and some at green. So how do you get people beyond those early expert achiever levels and into the post-conventional leadership levels, which make people more effective? So this was a driving question for my work very early. People who know the spiral know that it goes from left to right around expressing self and sacrificing self, but we get to the point of second tier and we start being able to be both expressing myself and sacrificing myself in appropriate doses and relationships. Tons to talk about here, but we don't have time. So I will go to the next quick slide to say, once I found Ken's work, I did a mental check of the model, which at this point, by the time I found Ken's work, I had pretty much created the first version of the assessment. But I went back through the assessment to say, does this assessment reflect stages of development, looking at the things I had just been talking about? Does this reflect multiple lines of intelligence? And I had already been thinking about IQ, EQ, SQ. So yes, I am connected to Ken's work that way. Do I have states of consciousness in here? And I do have a skill that focuses on states. But what I quickly clarified for myself is I do not believe that states of consciousness give you spiritual intelligence. A state is a temporary experience. You can stabilize non-dual awareness over time, but I was clear what I was going for was much more behavioral. I wanted sustained behavioral change. And I like to say I wrote this tool for myself as well. I wanted to know how to show up as love in the world. What skills would it take for me to stably show up as love in the world? We've probably heard stories of wonderful meditators who are very skilled at achieving states of consciousness, but are not skilled at interacting with other people in the world. And so states was not sufficient. It was included, but not sufficient. So that was clarifying. I sort of cross-checked with his 4 quadrants. I felt like I had reasonably covered that. And types of personalities, there's definitely a nod to some typology in the instrument. So Ken's work was fabulous because I was able to kind of cross-check and think about, is there anything I'm missing here before I go too much further? All right, so that's kind of the intro finish. I'm ready to move into the intelligence definitions, unless you have a question. You guys have a question?
Please continue. I would say, Onamali, do you have anything?
Okay, just jump in if you do. All right, so as I get into things, I'm very much a defining your words advocate. Like, don't just throw a word out there unless you can explain what it means. And I really appreciate that Ken does that as well. When I start talking about emotional and spiritual intelligence, which is where I focus, what do I mean by an intelligence? And this is based on Gardner's work on multiple intelligence and many other researchers. So if you do some work on Google, you'll find that if you boil it down, definitions of intelligence always hit these 2 points. One, that it's an innate potential brought into form through practice. The illustration is the little girl sitting at the piano. If she is born musically gifted, some kind of innate capacity, she has a potential, but she never touches a musical instrument and never learns music theory, she will not bring it into form through practice. I believe we are all born with spiritual intelligence potential, but we are not born spiritually intelligent. And this often causes a rub, particularly with people at Green, because they want to argue that we were spiritually intelligent when we were born and we lost it because this is a cruel world and we drive it out of people. And I would say not really in agreement with that. I would say children are born unconsciously connected to spirit. We have to become conscious and intentional and learn how to play the piano, learn how to be love in the world. There are a lot of skills involved in learning how to be love in the world. So I believe we're all born spiritual. I do not believe we are all born spiritually intelligent. So we have an innate hunger for this, we have innate potential, but we don't have the skills yet. If you develop your skills, here's the second bullet, you will end up with something you want. You will end up with appropriately reasoned behaviors or choices. You will get skillful at something. The 4 intelligences I focus on, because there's many that people talk about, but the ones I focus on are IQ, EQ, SQ, and PQ. IQ being the cognitive intelligence we're most familiar with. EQ is emotional intelligence, SQ spiritual, PQ physical. It is possible, this is a partial truth, to be highly developed on some and less developed on others. I'm going to show you the other piece of the truth. So I call this the vertical bar chart piece of the truth. There's some degree of independence of the intelligences. The next model will say that there is some degree of interconnection of these intelligences. So both things are true simultaneously. But I start here with people, and I usually will ask folks, have you ever known anybody who was highly intelligent on the IQ scale, but had lousy interpersonal skills? And generally people will bust out laughing and go, oh my God, you're talking about my boss. You're talking about my husband. You're talking about my brother, sister, mother, father, or whatever. You know, it's like people have stories about, oh yes, I definitely know that person. That illustrates this slight separation that you can be well developed on something and poorly developed on something else. The second piece of the truth is the interconnectivity or the pyramid model of the 4 intelligences. And here, partial truth, I look at this as a developmental sequence. As a newborn baby, we have a lot of things to learn, from learning how to focus our eyes and roll over and crawl, walk, run. body awareness is a massive effort of the newborn to the toddler to the preschool kid. We go to school and IQ comes to be the focus of schooling. Doesn't mean IQ is not developing earlier. Of course it was. Doesn't mean we don't keep developing our PQ as we go forward. But generally speaking, our school years in most educational systems focus heavily on IQ. And then our brain keeps developing. By the time we're 25, we're fully capable of EQ. The frontal cortex is generally wired up. And also the demands of our life context, our life conditions have changed such that we have jobs, romantic partnerships, things become more complex and demanding interpersonally. And so the demand, the need for EQ grows. Some people naturally develop it very quickly, and it's developing from childhood forward, of course, but the full capacity for it comes on board by about age 25. And I believe, the way I describe my skills, that you must have some EQ in order to develop SQ. You cannot develop SQ independent of EQ. So that would be, to me, the interconnection. And I see SQ then amplifying your EQ skills and EQ further amplifying your SQ skills. So there is a virtuous connection. PQ is coming, fortunately, more into focus these days. If you don't take care of the bottom of the pyramid, if you don't get sleep, exercise, good food, do the things we know we need to do to take care of our physical form and our physical health, it undermines all the other intelligences. So if you're exhausted and you're sugar low and you're just overall in terrible conditioning, you're not going to think as clearly, you're not going to be as good with your interpersonal skills. So there is a connection between these intelligences as well. IQ, I think we know plenty about. We over-focus on it a bit in our system. But one of the mistakes I like to point out is that a lot of people say, you don't need IQ to be successful, you need EQ to be successful, which is a complete misunderstanding of the research. The research initially said it takes IQ to get in the door of your profession. You need enough training and enough development to become an engineer, to become a school teacher, to become a bus driver. All of these have thresholds. But once you're in, what distinguishes performance is emotional intelligence. So it's a misstatement of the research to say it's EQ, not IQ, that makes you successful. It's both. You need both. All right. So, I've talked about that. So let's talk very briefly about EQ only in order to illustrate where SQ comes from. So I got certified in the Goleman-Boyatzis model of emotional intelligence back when it was called EI, and it was these 4 quadrants. They keep changing. They split 2 quadrants and 2 quadrants and call it emotional and social. So things have changed, but this was what I got trained on. And the basics are still true. Upper left quadrant in this model is self-awareness. Upper right in this is not Ken's model, is social awareness, lower left self-management, lower right relationship skills. So to get to relationship skills, you have to start in the upper left with self-awareness. I loved this. And my initial premise was these skills, which are now illustrated on this slide, would be the foundation for the next 4 quadrants of self-awareness, et cetera, that would stack on top of it and be called spiritual intelligence. In the emotional framework, there are 3 skills highlighted in yellow, which at one point Daniel Goleman called the meta skills, non-negotiable skills. They're emotional self-awareness, empathy, and emotional self-control. I would say that these 3 skills are also required, not just to get EQ, but to really begin developing SQ. And it'll become more obvious why that is, I think, as I go into a description of SQ. So I'll pause before I shift to SQ, say anything you want to talk about.
I would say take us all the way, Cindy, and then we can sort of reflect on the whole.
Okay, good. All right, so if we imagine, just to make a connection, a transition here, lower right quadrant on this slide, you see conflict management is listed. In order to be good at conflict management, you need to know when you're angry, emotional self-awareness, understand what's making you angry, be empathic if the other person is angry, have an imagination that would allow you to imagine why they're angry, manage your anger, and then be able to handle conflict. This makes it a little more obvious why it's going to matter when we move to spiritual intelligence. Now, when I define spiritual intelligence, my preference, if I have enough time, is to have people do this exercise. And if it's a big room, even better. I divide them into team tables. They all get a flip chart, and just, flip chart on your flip chart. Give me some names of people whom you admire, that you would consider to be spiritual leaders by whatever your definition of that is. But the crucial word is you have to admire them. Don't have to even be real people. They could be fictional, and they don't have to be perfect. After they do that, flip the page. Describe the characteristics, the traits of these people that cause you to admire them. And then we go around the room, and I have a master flip chart at the front, and I write down all the things that people have said on these 2 pages. The list, no matter what culture I have been in, I haven't hit every culture on the planet, but I've traveled pretty widely. I see a lot of overlap with the names, but it does vary. The names will vary by culture, who it is that people in that culture look to as a religious figure or a political agent of change. But the kinds of people listed are like Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, the Dalai Lama, Gandhi, and so on. And we get through all of that and we say, okay, great. Now, why do you admire them? This is where it distills pretty quickly. These are the kinds of characteristics that will come up again and again. These people are loving, compassionate, humble, wise, courageous, faithful, forgiving, accepting of other people, stay calm, have integrity, are nonviolent, are great teachers. They don't give up. They persist in the face of tremendous difficulty, and can see the gifts inside of other people. Once they post all of this, and I've summarized it up on the front, I say, are there any of these characteristics that you do not want in your business? And they'll look at that for a minute, and generally somebody will say, I want all of that. Can I have all of that? and I say, are there any of these characteristics that you might like to have more of yourself? And people, yeah, I want more of this or that or whatever. What they've just done is brought into their conscious awareness their own understanding of spiritual intelligence. Before I tell them what I think it is, I want them to tell me what they think it is, because this is what they're going to buy into. They're not going to buy into Cindy's definition. They're going to buy into their own definition of who are the people they most admire. Who might they like to be a little bit more like? From that, I go into my definitions. And I quickly define spirituality and religion, because those are words that are often misunderstood. I define spirituality as an innate human need to be connected to something larger than ourselves, something that we consider to be sacred or noble or divine, whatever words they prefer. The innate human need is a nod to Maslow. I believe that we are born, unless we have severe brain trauma, we are born with an innate human need to be connected to something larger than ourselves. Most people can get on board with this definition, especially when I contrast it to how I define religion, which is religion is a structure that can help us meet our spiritual needs. There is nothing in spiritual intelligence that requires someone to have specific beliefs or to be part of a religion. And I'm very careful to keep spirituality, religion, and spiritual intelligence separate, because it's important for honoring people's faith traditions, or if they're atheists or agnostics, fine. There's lots to do with spiritual intelligence, no matter what your belief system is. So then I tell people how I come to this definition I'm about to share of spiritual intelligence, which is, for me, as I look at those spiritual leaders, one of the most defining attributes is they are love in action. So to me, what I wanted as my goal is, how can I be a more loving person? Well, the word love is very problematic. And if you go out looking for definitions of love, you will find Greek and Latin words and all kinds of complex theories and 30-page definitions of love, and none of that's helpful. So what I would say is, I needed something simple, and I finally found a parable from the Eastern traditions that is fairly simple and beautiful. And it's that love is a bird with 2 wings. One wing is compassion, the other wing is wisdom. And if either wing is broken, the bird cannot fly. And to me, this embodied what I was getting at: the best of the head, the best of the heart, wisdom and compassion coming together to bring love into the world. If you're only wise but not compassionate, you're only operating from the head and not the heart, you can do harm. If you're only compassionate, but you don't have a wisdom of perspective taking to be able to see what would be helpful in this situation, you can unintentionally do harm. So for me, this was a beautiful place to start. I ended up with this definition, that spiritual intelligence is the ability to behave with wisdom and compassion, love, while maintaining inner and outer peace, regardless of the situation. And that last bullet is the saintly level of this, meaning no matter what is going on, you can stay in this place. And the middle bullet, while maintaining inner and outer peace, really speaks to the need to self-control, to keep your higher self on board and not let the ego just run away with you. There is an inward out. If you're only peaceful on the outside, that's better than not having any self-control. But if you're using force of will to maintain that, it's exhausting. So if you can unseat the interpretation of a situation that would normally make you angry, angry is very exhausting. Instead, see with more humble curiosity, and I will come back to that at the end. There's a release and an ability to sustain the self-control that is not present if you're fighting all the time. So degrees, stages of development, self-control is better than no control, but finding that inner place of peace is even better. So compassion, an interesting word. Sometimes people want to spend time on it. I see it as helpful to define these terms. Empathy and compassion get confused. I see them as two different things. There is some research to support them as two different things. So I'll sometimes walk people through that. You know, in the English language, we say apathy means I don't care. Sympathy is more like pity. I see and I care, but I'm mostly annoyed that you're in my space and making me uncomfortable with your homelessness or whatever your problem is. Empathy is peer-to-peer, and compassion is the ability to feel what you're feeling, but not get lost in it. People who have too much empathy get lost in the feeling with, and compassion is a step beyond that. And there's some nice research around what that means in terms of parts of the brain. But that's how I explain compassion. And wisdom has a similar hierarchy. You go from data to information to knowledge, which means you've made a system out of your information that gives you the ability to do good stuff with it. And wisdom, which is beyond just knowledge, which is the sort of ability to bring in many other streams of information, not just data, but also the emotional, social circumstances and cultural influences and historical influences, and see a larger time horizon and much more than just raw data and information. So those are the two hierarchies of moving up to love on each wing. The essential move is the move from operating from ego to operating from higher self. We have large glossaries that allow people to use other words. If they don't like the words ego, they don't like the words higher self, we have faith-based glossaries on our website. We also have a long generic glossary, and people can find the language to connect to these. But that's the essence, is you have to be interested in shifting from operating from ego to operating from higher self. And when we talk about operating from ego, if we get enough time to delve into it with clients, we talk about ego's not bad. Ego needs to grow up. And so we talk about that. Yes, Nomali.
Cindy, just quick question. Can you give us just a couple other examples from that glossary that you have for ego self and higher self?
Well,
just a few other examples, maybe one or two other examples.
Oh, yeah. So there's a whole lot of words like spirituality and religion are in there. What's a worldview is defined in there, because worldview is very important in terms of skill building. What is a belief system? What is
no, I think maybe I wasn't clear enough. I meant for ego self and higher self.
Oh, for those particular terms. Yes. So for ego self, like personality self, or human self, material self, you know, people will have a psychological self, different terms they might prefer to ego. And higher self has a huge number of synonyms: my soul, my spirit, Atman, Christ consciousness, true self, authentic self. Those would be some of the synonyms. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mhm. So we talk about, when we talk about spiritual intelligence, shifting from ego self to higher self, I take pains to not demonize the ego. There are spiritual traditions that kind of want to obliterate the ego. I personally don't think that's possible or advisable, but that has in part to do with how I'm defining the ego, which is the structure that enables me to interact with the world. I want a developed ego. I want a mature ego, and I want the ego to interact with my higher self and be guided by my higher self. So we'll talk about how do you know you're in your ego. If you're in your high drama mode, you're probably in your ego. If you're ruminating on negative thinking, you're probably in your ego. We can talk about all of that in a very non-threatening way, even in a corporate setting. I'd like to make people laugh. Here's an image of an immature ego, either self-obsessed, the guy combing his one hair that's left on the top of his head, or the woman who is blaming and pointing outward, and it's always everybody else's fault. A couple of illustrations of immature ego. Oh, here we go. Some synonyms. I had it in the deck. No, Molly, I was reading your mind. Some ways people might synonyms for ego. Higher self, I just picked these pictures because I loved them. This woman on the left, all the wrinkles of age, she has pretty much no teeth left and she doesn't care. She's smiling. And there's this sense of, to me, I feel joy radiating from inside out without a concern for this stuff, you know? And for the guy on the right, and this could be me projecting, but I see sadness and wisdom and lots of life experience and the ability to be present in spite of that. So there's something in these pictures that for me help me think about what does a human mature operating from higher self potentially look like. People can find images that resonate for them, but those resonated for me. Some synonyms, again, for the higher self. And how do these two get along? I'd like to use the image of the ego has a role to play on Earth. It's like Google Maps for navigating Earth. You know, how do you deal with humans? Other egos. There's other egos everywhere. How do we navigate egos? Well, my ego will understand other egos. Higher self may be a little too removed, but ultimately I want higher self driving my car. So I think of it as higher self's behind the wheel, but in partnership with the ego, who's providing important navigational assistance, and they are good partners. All right. That whirlwind tour has finally gotten us to what's the model? And so the model is another 4 quadrants, not like Ken's. These are more like the top 2 quadrants in Ken's. So you could put these 4 in the top 2 of Ken's 4 quadrants. But it's like the emotional intelligence 4 quadrants, where the upper left is where you start and the lower right is where you're trying to get to. If you're trying to get to social mastery and spiritual presence, being a wise and effective teacher, being a wise and effective leader or change agent, making compassionate and wise decisions, being a calming and healing presence in the world, and being aligned with the ebb and flow of life. The top 2 quadrants are, you can start on either side of that dotted line. The Eastern religions, I think, tend to focus more on starting on the universal awareness side, meditating until you get connection of the sense of the interconnection of all life, having breakthrough perceptions of non-dual reality, experience of transcendent oneness. And from that, perhaps drive to the left about how's that going to help me be a better human. In the West, we tend to be more psychologically oriented and a little more narcissistic maybe, where we want to focus on me. What's my perspective? Well, I'm an INTJ and I'm a Myers-Briggs 5. That's me, Cindy. And that affects my worldview. So as I understand myself and I understand my perspectives and how I interpret things, then I can start becoming aware of the worldviews of others. Wow, you know, I'm an introvert, but how do extroverts perceive this? I'm a thinking style. How does a feeling style person perceive this? And so on. So I ended up, long story short, building this by first drawing the 4 quadrants. And I said, this is my hypothesis, that there will be these 4 quadrants and they will be called this, you know, ego self, higher self-awareness, universal awareness, ego self, higher self-mastery, social mastery, and spiritual presence. if that's true, what skills would those spiritual leaders that we listed at the beginning have? If I took them collectively, they might not all have all of them, but if I took them collectively, how would I describe these skills? And this is what I came up with. Now, people might recognize things that occur in other places, like being aware of your life purpose and being aware of your values hierarchy. But I put it here because it wasn't an emotional intelligence, and I felt it needed to be explicitly part of someone who's living from higher self. You need to know what your purpose is, you need to know what your values are, and you need to rank order your values. So they're very pragmatic stuff in the upper left that people can work on. You have to want to get to skill 13 of keeping your higher self in charge. If somebody's not interested in keeping their higher self in charge, they're probably not ready to work with this tool. But if that is an appealing thought, then this tool can certainly help them figure it out. I wrote the roadmap I wished someone had handed me when I was 16 and asking the universe for wisdom. I wish someone handed me Daniel Goleman, Richard Boyatzis's model and this model and said, work on these skills and you will become the person you're hoping to become. So I can go on or pause. All right, I'll go on. One of my concerns was that this had to be very rigorous. I have a lot of orange in me from a spiral dynamic standpoint. I'm a thinking style person. I worked in the oil industry. You see this guy with the hard hat. And I wanted to be able to use industry as my reality check. I wanted to be able to go into any company with highly trained scientists, engineers, whatever, who would say, is this stuff legit? And I wanted to be able to explain this was created with a PhD level of rigor. Although I don't have a PhD, I hired PhDs to help me create and validate this tool. And it is skills focused and not belief focused. So you are not required to believe anything to start looking at these skills and choosing to work on some. Each of these skills has been described from what would be considered a beginner or level 1 to level 5, which would be the highest we can describe for that skill. And I'll walk through this one as an illustration. This is skill 5, being aware of your ego self and higher self. At level 1, all you have to do is have a basic understanding that an ego exists. That's all. Cognitive knowledge only required. At level 2, I can observe my own ego in operation. So now I have become an active observer and I'm, oh, wow, that was little Miss High Drama me that just came on board. So that was ego eruption right there. At level 3, I've been watching myself long enough that I can recognize the situations and types of people that trigger my ego to want to take charge. So I'm observing patterns. At level 4, I can consistently hear the voice of my higher self. And at level 5, the voice of my higher self is now the principal voice I hear. And ego is no longer in combat for power and control. It is now in joyful service to spirit or higher self. So the scores on the SQ21, which is a self-assessment people can take, go from 0, which means I haven't started working on this skill yet, or maybe I misunderstood the question. We have to go back and look at all the zeros. And it goes from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with 5 being the highest level we know how to describe. One more illustration so that people can see how this system works. Being aware of other people's worldviews may be one of the most important skills for navigating reality right now. We are in a very crazy time of perspectives that are in complete disagreement with each other. And so having the capacity to listen to differing points of view, just to listen, is the beginning of this skill. At level 2, you go beyond just listening to actively seeking out, how can I learn about other people's perspectives, even perspectives that bother me. Level 3, I tune into other people's worldviews even during a conflict, so when emotions are high. At level 4, I have compassion for the hopes and fears that we all experience as human beings. Our worldviews come out of contexts, and those contexts include what we hope for and what we're afraid of. And at level 5, I can see through the perspective of others, even those who act to harm me. A very relevant skill for trying to transcend ongoing pervasive conflict. fourth quadrant gets us to the goals, which is spiritual mastery, spiritual presence, and social mastery. And I've read these out before. The one I didn't read before was being aligned with the ebb and flow of life, which is a peace-giving thing. You sort of come to see the natural flow and take a much bigger perspective, which can be very calming. Now, before I go on to showing you the data about how spiritual intelligence is related to higher stages of development, we can take a breath, or I could shift over to some exercises on how people can develop SQ. Well, let's talk about stages of adult development, because generally speaking, integral audiences are really interested in what gets people to yellow and beyond. How can we get people to second tier? And to make it personal, how do I get to second tier? You know, so I did a research project with Suzanne Cook-Reuter, who was wonderful, and thank you, Suzanne. Back then, she was calling her tool the SCTI, the Sentence Completion Test Integral, and the output was the Maturity Assessment Profile. I think she might have rebranded a little bit, but that's what it was called back then. And everyone who came to her to take this sentence completion test and get a maturity assessment profile was offered a free SQ21. And we had 139 people do both, complete both assessments. And from that, I had a person crunch the numbers for me. Oops. Essentially, the conclusion of the research was that higher stages, as we know, are crucial to face complex life conditions, and higher spiritual intelligence is very strongly positively correlated with higher stages of development. Now, correlation is not the same as causation, but it points you in the direction. I would have been concerned had there been no correlation between high SQ and high stage of development. So I'll show you, reminding you of this map, that the expert is light blue and the achiever is orange as kind of an anchor point. Okay, so here are the results of the 139 data points. And you can see we go from diplomat at the left, which is early blue, to expert, which is late blue orange, all the way up to ironist, which is what she was calling the stage at the end. So magician and ironist would be second tier people. As you look at the purple line, which is going from left to right, it is going steadily up. That is looking at the mean in each of those groupings. So the expert would have a mean of about 54, it looks like. The achiever would have a mean of about 58. Individualist would have an average or mean of 67 approximately, it looks like, and so on. And then you get up to the ironist and you see you're in the high 80s. Now the data sample gets smaller as you get to the ironist level, but what was encouraging here was the steady upward trend on the purple line. Now, what was puzzling initially was the achiever, which is the third vertical red line. And here you see the achiever goes from about 21 or 22 all the way up to the high 80s, maybe 86, 87. And it's like, wow, that is an enormous range. That's the biggest range of all these ranges. The ranges get smaller as you go to the right. So the lowest level magician is at 55. Approximately. So what does that mean? Well, what it says to me is achiever, which is peak orange, can have very low SQ or pretty high SQ. Would I rather work with a high SQ person whose center of gravity is orange? Remember, people are more than one color. But if their center of gravity is orange or achiever, I would much rather work with someone who also has good emotional and spiritual intelligence skills, and I would expect that achiever would be more successful in life. So they would be more capable as an achiever, more competent as an achiever than the achiever with the lower scores potentially. So that would be my hypothesis. But this was very encouraging to me, because had I not seen this, I would have really wondered about what I was doing, right? So my thoughts are that PQ is like really having a strong beige foundation, which you maintain throughout your life. IQ is peaked at orange, doesn't mean it doesn't keep going, but really necessary for full inhabitation of orange. EQ necessary for full inhabitation of green, and SQ necessary for full inhabitation of second tier, yellow and turquoise. So how do we get there? The simplest way I know how to describe this, to shift from ego to higher self, is in between events in our lives and our responses. And a response can be a thought, and a feeling, something we say or something we do, we have to learn to insert a pause. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, very powerful book, I think made this point, that our power remains with us as long as we are able to choose our own responses to circumstances, no matter how dire. So in the pause is our power. That's the way I help people remember it. Insert a pause and you have your power. Then how do you learn?
Just super quickly in that particular slide, the slide before this one, you had sort of somehow synced the stages into the intelligences here, right? And then the slide after that, where it says event in your life and your response, that actually aligns pretty nicely with the life conditions of spiral dynamics, in that sort of the double helix that is taught in spiral dynamics. Yes. The life condition and your psychological maturity results in how we sort of create those value memes. So this sort of aligns nicely with that as well.
I would agree. And if you look at this chart and you think about the internal capacities of the person who has achieved strategist, magician, or ironist, the range of options for response are much broader than the range of options for response of someone at the diplomat or impulsive stages, which would be at the low end.
Yeah.
Right. So how do we build spiritual muscle? And when we do workshops, we talk about, there's a 9-step process that I've outlined, which is a generic, faith-neutral process to help people, and then a 4-step shortcut, because in the moment it's hard to remember 9. But to do the heavy lifting to really build the muscle, there's 9 steps here. And the steps are learning to insert that pause. So mental stop, deep breath to get control and shift your parasympathetic and your sympathetic to the parasympathetic. I tend to get that wrong, but get the vagal system working with you so that your brain is calm and operating at maximum functionality. So calming your body, breathing, calming your body, asking for help, which could be divine or human. People will insert the word prayer here if they prefer that. They might say stop, breathe, pray are their first 3 steps. Stop, breathe, and sometimes I just in my mind say help, and I'm calling on my higher self and higher power. Help me see this differently. Help me know what to do. That's a humility act, and we'll come back to humility again, I think, at the end. Learn to observe what is going on with me. My stomach is tense. I'm clenching my shoulders and my fists. I'm gritting my teeth. All of this is important observation that I am triggered, right? So relaxing those parts of my body, noticing if my heart is racing, if need be, and I need a longer pause, remove myself from the room, say, I'll be right back and take a restroom break. Learn to identify and embrace the ego concerns. Can't always happen in the moment of a crisis or a thing, a fight, something that's happening. But later on, journaling or reflecting on what I was scared of, why was I triggered? Oh, this sounded exactly like what used to happen to me when I was a kid at school and the teacher would blah, blah. Or this reminds me of what my mom or dad used to say, or whatever the trigger is. And loving our egos, not shaming them, embracing them from the aspect of higher self. I remember a Thich Nhat Hanh retreat I attended, which was very impactful for me. And he was teaching about how to deal with anger. And he said, hold your anger in your arms as if it's a precious infant and say, I see you. I love you. You are safe. And I thought, what a beautiful metaphor for embracing, not shaming our ego. Hold it and love it from the higher self's energy. Look deeply for why I'm upset, root causes. The first cause is usually not the real cause. I'm mad because he took away my whatever, or he was stealing attention away from me in the middle of my presentation or whatever. Well, why are you afraid of that? And why are you worried about that? And why are you worried about that? Once you get through to your deeper causes, you'll find you relax and quit blaming so much. And now you have some spaciousness to reframe. Reframing is my single favorite spiritual intelligence tool. is learning to see the thing differently, because when I see it differently, I'm not so upset. I might even have compassion and insight, wisdom and compassion for how I should respond in this situation. When you can focus on something to be grateful for, if you use the word God in your internal dialogue, that's fine. If you don't, just don't. I'm grateful to be here to help someone in this time of need, or I'm grateful that I have these tools to take a deep breath and not do the thing I usually do. And then choose a more spirit-based, higher self-based response. Insert synonym of choice. Choose a more loving response. You can do the first three at least immediately, and the other ones you might have to do later, except what you want to try and do is in the moment, have the most loving response that you can have in that moment, which might be to leave the room. Your most loving response might be, look, I'm really triggered right now. I need some time to process. I'm going to go take a walk. So here we are on step 7, reframing, my absolute favorite of the skills in that 9-step process. And it is the one I go to all the time to sort of adjust myself mentally. And reframing is literally like looking at a window frame and pulling the frame back so that you can see more. We see through a constrained perspective, and I'm trying to see a larger perspective. So in a workshop, I'd put this clip art up and ask people to describe, what do you see? And they'd say, I see cardinals, I see snow, I see a tree that hasn't leafed out yet, I see a barn or something in the background. And tell me what interpretations you make of this. Oh, well, I'm imagining it's cold outside, but spring is coming, and I'm inside and I have my hot cocoa and I'm in front of the fireplace. People will have this whole story, which is an illustration of how we narrate our lives. We fill in and tell a story and interpret. And I say, so what's your feeling state looking at this? Oh, it feels very peaceful and beautiful. And then I say, okay, let's pull the window frame back. Now, what do you see? Now, the clip art is not great, but it's intended to be fire back there. So, okay, the building back there is on fire. This is new data. Now, how do you feel with new data? Oh my gosh, now I got to call 911. I got to call my neighbor, make sure they get out of the house. I got to, so everything is different because of the addition of one piece of data. The question I ask myself when I'm looking at a situation where, especially if I'm judging someone, is how does God, how does love see this person? God knows all, as I imagine the word God. If I were an omnipotent being who knew all and knew this person's life and knew this person's heart, what would I see? I would see a being who's scared. I would see a being who's whatever. So as soon as I ask the question, what else is going on and what would love see? I'm knocking myself out of my initial frame where I had this very narrow Cindy judgment. Cindy's ego is seeing this. What does Cindy's higher self potentially see here? See a bigger frame. The question then gets illustrated with exercises. So great to talk about it, but let's do some exercises. So great workshop exercise, depending on what the company's going through. Excuse the silly clip art, but it's sometimes helpful to illustrate. Are you happy that you're promoted? Most people would be very happy. And this in the medical world, being promoted to head of staff is a huge job. So it's like, yay, I've been promoted to head of staff. Would you be depressed or sad if you lost your job suddenly? Oh, yeah, and we go through waves of layoffs. Sometimes I'd be in a company that was going through one. Yes, absolutely, I'd be depressed. And then I would ask people, can you imagine that you could reverse these captions? That you'd be going, I lost my job. Thank God I lost my job. Or could you imagine, oh my God, I just got promoted to head of staff? Absolutely. And they quickly tell stories about how either one of those could be true. So the interpretation is not completely linked to the facts, even though our ego likes to think there's one and one correct interpretation of everything. The softening of the frame begins with questioning that story, that narrative, that interpretation. So the prayer might be, please help me to see this differently when I'm locked up with something. We then play with other exercises like the grocery store express lane. Have you ever been in line behind someone in the express lane and the sign says limit 12 and they've got like 25 or 30 things in their basket? And do you go into judgment mode? And one of the helpful games to play is, let's just flip chart every nasty, witchy little thought you might have about that person. Well, they only care about themselves, blah, blah, blah. And so we make this list chart and everybody's laughing and kind of having a good time listing all the ways in which they're busy judging that person. And maybe they get up to the counter, and remember the days of writing a check? Occasionally you still see people write a check, and then they pull the checkbook out and they hadn't even started filling it out before they got in line. It's like, oh, come on, you're still writing checks and you didn't even get started ahead of time. So, people will get all judgy. And then I'll say, okay, now let's change how you're thinking about it. Would there ever be a circumstance during which time you would be the person in line with 25 things in your basket in the express lane? And then there's this moment of awkward silence that fills the room. Okay, take some time and write down reasons you might do it, talk about your tables, and people will come back with we can flip chart a whole page of reasons why people might be in that lane. Oh, I just came to this country and I don't read English and I don't understand the sign. Okay. I'm vision impaired and I didn't see the sign. I have a real emergency and I've got to get home and I've got to have these things because I'm about to have to stay with my mother for a week while she's recovering from surgery, and I've got to have a week's worth of food with me. So people will make up stories that allow spaciousness and forgiveness. Given the opportunity and question, they will do that. The ego will make up the judgment and nasty stories. The higher self, given space and given some creativity and some curiosity, will come up with alternate stories. And then we'll talk about, all right, how do you feel now? Oh, I just am so much more relaxed. Well, next time you're being triggered in line, could you do this? Well, yeah. Okay, well, right there, you've just become more spiritually intelligent, more able to express love in your life. I have one more example. If you want to hear one more story, it might make me cry if I tell it to you, but I have one more example if you'd like to hear it.
Please.
Yes.
Okay, so I did a lot of work with healthcare for a while, and at one of the hospitals I was working with, the nurses, oh my God, I have such admiration for nurses. This was pre-COVID. And I have even more admiration for nurses post-COVID, but pre-COVID, getting to know the nurses and what they deal with was amazing. And coaching and doing team building for a lot of the units, I saw the conflicts that would go on. The night shift and the day shift would often be having fights, and, somebody doesn't do something they're supposed to do or whatever. And they're human beings, and they constrain themselves so much in the patient room and with family members that some of the bitchiness comes out sideways with each other. So I found this exercise and gave it to groups of nurses, and they'd be sitting at their tables, and I say, here's what's happened. Nurse, we'll give her a name, Shirley, is in the break area where they go in, not to take their break necessarily, but to get snacks for the patients and water and whatever for the patients. So there's like a little refrigerator, it's a little separate nook, a microwave in there. And a nurse is in there just doing whatever she's doing. And another nurse walks by with an open container of milk and slams the milk down on the floor, throwing it down right where that other first nurse is standing. And the milk comes out and splashes all down her leg and into her shoe, into her socks and into her shoe. So now she's going to be squishing in milk for the rest of her shift. Think about all the ego judgments that you're going to be having about that, what just happened. What would your ego say? And they, what is wrong with that person? So all of those come out. And I go, okay, now let's take some deep breaths. I want you to write a story about what would cause you to be the person that threw the milk. You threw the milk and you threw it in anger. Why did you throw the milk? Well, the favorite story, the number one story that came back is that woman is sleeping with my husband. So that was the number one story. I had just found out she was sleeping with my husband. Boom. Okay. And there'd be some chuckles about that and whatever. And then there'd be a few other stories. But there was one story that I will remember until the day I die, I hope. It was so beautiful. And it was a nurse who stood up, very meek, had not spoken much during the class, and she read her story from her piece of paper. And she said, I work in pediatric oncology, and we had a child who had a terrible time recovering from his cancer treatments. We had finally, after months of him being in isolation and all kinds of restrictions, he was able to start seeing family, and family were finally coming in to see him. And there's a big sign on the door, no dairy products. The child is allergic to dairy. A family member comes in with an open container of milk, and the child drank from it and didn't make it. And this is a fictional story, and we were all crying. It's like, that is the power of a different perspective. Would you be the one that was furious at the milk, not furious at the nurse, and walked down the hall and threw it? So if you can cry about it or laugh about it, you have shifted your perspective. And that's the goal. And now let's talk.
Wow. Just beautiful, Cindy. What a way to bring it all to what really matters.
Mhm.
Yes, so Cindy, thanks for sharing all of your work and in such detail that we can also see the evolution of your work and how you arrived at the interventions that you use. I was wondering, did you arrive at the 21 skills as a process that you described, where you sort of accumulated all of the descriptive words in the audiences that you interacted with, and then sort of bucketed those descriptors into the 21 skills?
No, I did this in isolation with my enormous library first, kind of reading about and looking at the kind of people that I thought would be exemplars. I knew they were for me, and I thought might be spiritual exemplars for others. In the world of multiple intelligences, one of the criteria for a legit intelligence is you have to be able to point to exemplars of the intelligence. So I was looking for the exemplars and looking for what differentiated them. Here's EQ. What did Jesus or the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh have that was the next level up? Don't repeat what's been described. What's the next step up? Then, with the help of Dr. Judy Neal, she helped me put together a focus group. And we went through, as I was building this tool, and I had a PhD and a master's degree person helping me write the questions to describe. I'd say, here's how the skill, here's how I describe it. How do we break this down from beginner and build it up to expert? How could we write questions around that? All of that was run by my focus group of people as we had very first draft of each quadrant. So we worked all the way through quadrant 1, and they helped me think about how I was describing the skills. Was I describing them well? Was level 2 really harder than level 3? Should I reverse them? What did I miss? What was left out? What was confusing? That focus group was invaluable. So they were kind of my very first pilot after sitting in my office and thinking about things.
Interesting. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Europe we have the ESCO framework, which is basically a skills and competencies framework, and in Australia they have, I think, ONET, and they also have something similar in the US, I believe. And I know they do it in a similar way, where they break down skills into levels of skillfulness, and then people can sort of assess where someone is at a particular skill level. And is your spiritual intelligence part of a framework like that?
No, maybe one day.
Yeah, because it's interesting how you've made it measurable.
Yes, and that was my goal, was to build something that would last, that was research worthy. I'm hoping that at some point there will be some faculty members in universities that be willing to take this tool and do research with it. That's what's happened with EQ. Initially, it was a weird field, like, what is this field? And now, of course, everybody researches it. I would love for my tool to be one of the tools out there where I have support from academia to maybe create a research version of it, which is shorter. It has the current tool is too large for most people to do research with unless they structure their research just right. There have been some who have done some really nice research with it, but I'm hoping, if I'm going to vision what I want to dream, I dream that this has a life in academia, to take it in its own way, and that this has a life in organizational consulting, and that this has a life in anywhere else that it's relevant for helping make humans live into their potential, help humans live into their potential. And we can't make them, but help them live into their potential by describing and giving them a scaffold to kind of, okay, here's how I can work my way up in these skills.
Nice.
Yeah. Cindy, it's such a valuable tool that you have developed, and it's clear to see what, I mean, we only just, as you said, this is a huge presentation, and we only just got a small glimpse into it. I'm curious about the application of SQ21 in, even with your last story about the milk carton, perspective taking as one of the beautiful gifts that hopefully some of us can actually practice in the world. How would you use SQ21 in a world where there is a lot of struggle and strife and challenge? And, right now there's the Russia-Ukraine war going on. There is the horrible, unending death and violence in Israel and Palestine going on. And that's just two things. There's gun violence every day in the US. There's this overwhelming level of struggle and challenge in the world. How would you advise someone that has taken your course or wants to take your SQ21 book into their library? How can we use that in really looking at some of these big problems of the world?
Yes. So my second favorite tool, which assists my first favorite is reframing, is zooming in and zooming out. And zooming in and zooming out for me assists me in reframing. So when we were talking about imagine what that nurse must have been going through who threw the milk, we were shifting into her hypothetical possible reasons that created a heartfelt response so that I could hold her in love and go and be interested and curious. And honey, are you okay? What's going on today? And provide what might be needed in that moment. When I am looking at Israel, for example, so I'll just do real life, Israel and Gaza and the West Bank and the Middle East, and I got my master's in political science. I am a junkie who's interested in global affairs. I try to hold multiple perspectives. I try. And yet I am also human, and I have a knee-jerk repulsion to what Hamas did and have a visceral, there is no way this behavior can be okay. There is just no way. The person who committed the terrorist act, you might be able to understand from a spiritually intelligent perspective what formed them, and then get to root causes around how to stop forming terrorism, how to stop forming terrorists, but not going to victim blaming. That's also, I think, a spiritual overreaction that I see in some people in the US right now, is making Israel wrong for what happened. This is a very big context with a huge history. And so zooming out and zooming in. The first thing I did was I tried to zoom in because I don't know a ton of stuff. There's a lot of stuff I don't know about Gaza and the West Bank and all the history that has led to the logjam that we're at, and to quickly remind myself to increase granularity. Hamas is not the same. It's not synonymous with the citizens of Gaza. So that was the first immediate increase in granularity I needed to make. Furthermore, the West Bank is not Gaza. Not all Palestinians feel the same way. You have as much diversity of opinion in any population So there's going to be people all over the map who would call themselves Palestinians. The second thing I do, I sort of zoom in and then zoom way out. And I look way back in history. This has been going on for thousands of years. There's been people fighting in the Middle East. The deep roots of the cultural conflicts, I don't know. But I know humanity has long grudges. We are still fighting the Civil War in the United States. I think a lot of what is going on right now is still the North and the South are still fighting, only it's no longer just a geography thing. So humans tend to fight. Back out to look at the whole history of planet Earth, back out to look at the whole cosmos, back out to look at the Big Bang. And remember, we are a tiny piece of a very big thing. Where one thing captures my mind and takes over my life is when I know I have to zoom out. And remember, this is an evolutionary story that includes humanity as a very small piece of the evolutionary story. It is possible that there is some evolutionary progress to be had from the breaking up of this logjam, simultaneous with the inexcusable misery that is going on. So can I hold those two things at the same time? When I need relief, I change my zoom. I zoom in to get more details and more granularity. And when I'm profoundly overwhelmed by the sadness of it, I zoom way out and take an evolutionary perspective that says, there is hope that we will learn from this because we have learned from other things, but there is also truth that the learning is often horrible and many people suffer to get there. So I can pray and I can have hope and sustain my faith in spite of all of this complexity.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you, Cindy. My next question for you that came up for me, Cindy, is around development itself. And with spiritual intelligence as a line of development, obviously, we are sort of in some ways aiming at developing within that line of intelligence. It would be good for us to have a higher level of development in spiritual intelligence. And just like with any line of intelligence, there's also shadow. With any level of development, there's also shadow. So at the higher levels of spiritual intelligence, what's a shadow that you teach, or what's a shadow that can emerge or appear that we also want to be looking out for?
Well, I think spirituality, as a lot of people learn it and practice it, can go wrong in two commonly occurring ways: spiritual bypassing and spiritual abuse. The spiritual bypass is, la, 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 it's all an illusion, and I'm just going to meditate myself out of this reality because none of this is real. And, if I stay in my bliss field, I won't suffer. But that is a disengagement from life that I find unloving and therefore does not meet my definition of what I'm trying to be in my life. The spiritual abuse happens when people get a piece of spiritual truth and then beat everyone else over the head with it. And one of the ways that happens is when people realize the power of their thoughts. I am a longtime member of Unity, which is a Christian denomination, which is very progressive. It's part of the New Thought movement, and it teaches the power of thought and the power of affirmative prayer. You can bring bad stuff into your life with negative thinking. You can increase the odds of good stuff in your life with positive thinking. If you believe you can, you'll try. And if you try, you might succeed. But I think it gets magical thinking substituted for sophisticated thinking around this sometimes. And self-abuse and abuse of others can occur from that. The reason you got cancer is because your thinking was wrong. And if you would just get your thinking right, the cancer would go away. Well, that's a horrible thing. Number one, to inflict on yourself if you're inflicting it on yourself, and to inflict on anybody else. Nobody gets to tell me what my life conditions mean. If something is coming back to me, I have to reflect on, did I cause this? Did I bring this to me? Did something I do set this off? But that's not for you to do to me or for me. So I would say shadow spiritually superior, telling other people. Another shadow is state addiction, thinking that just being in bliss states is sufficient, and it's not.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So very much the sort of really engaging and taking the zooming in, zooming out perspective on your own engagement of your spiritual development as well.
Exactly.
Very quickly, Cindy, I want, from the time that you did your research and have sort of developed this large body of work, in the recent years, just maybe even just the last 5 years or so, in the mainstream, there's a lot more conversation now about trauma, childhood trauma. More than it was all, I mean, obviously for people in the field of psychology and childhood development, it was always a serious conversation for psychotherapists, obviously. But now there's a little bit more awareness of childhood trauma. So in the mainstream, with some of the earlier skills, you could even say that some of those were coping skills, or the lack of spiritual intelligence or letting go. I'm just curious if you have any sort of brief comments on trauma in relation to spiritual intelligence.
I am not an expert in trauma, but I will say that I'm a big fan of psychotherapy. I've had a lot myself. Good therapy. There's bad therapy out there too. But in learning to reinterpret my own childhood experiences, I learned a lot about what were my triggers and my blind spots and areas I needed to work on, or I would just get to keep repeating things like marrying the wrong person. What you're not conscious of, you just can act out endlessly. So becoming conscious of the wounds and finding a more constructive way to heal the wounds was very important. Trauma is an interesting specialty, I think hugely important. And I worry a little bit that everything becomes trauma, like people, it almost becomes a badge, like what's your trauma? Let's compare traumas. My trauma is bigger than your trauma. I think when it gets to be too cute, it's not helpful. It is really hurtful to the people who have genuine, like I use the word trauma in my mind for things that had really serious impact on a person's biophysiology, psychology. I don't want to be flippant with that word. I want to be very careful with that word. But I am grateful that people are looking at both individual and collective trauma and familial trauma that passes down unto the seventh generation. The sins of the father shall be passed. The sins of the mother, too, by the way. That's just, I think, the old patriarchal wording. But I think what the sins mean are the errors and the misunderstandings and the wounds that the family carry forward in the family, often unconsciously. And I think all of that's really helpful to try and bring into awareness. How much of that is transmitted through DNA? How much of that is transmitted through familial karma or other means that are metaphysical? I don't know. But I'm glad the conversations are taking place.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Cindy, for this incredible teaching and presentation that you gave us today. I hope more and more people have access to you. So that brings me to the question, is the assessment something that is available somewhere online that people can take, and where can they do that?
Yes, my website is deepchange.com, and the assessment is available there. You can purchase it for retail. Or you can hire a coach. And if people are interested, they can just email me, cindy@deepchange.com. You can take the assessment and then decide you want to coach. We've trained over 400 people at this point in how to debrief this tool. Or you can just start with a coach and do it through them, and then they will debrief you. You can start in either direction. But if they have any questions, you can go to deepchange.com. There's lots of information under resources. You can email me at cindy@deepchange.
Well, wonderful. Well, Cindy, and thanks so much. And yes, it was really enjoyable to see more of your work.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Until next time. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.